everyone, my name is Nikki Green. Firstly, I would like to thank Jack and Rob for asking me to contribute to their winter wellness plan. I will be delivering a condensed version of supporting your child's emotional regulation. So this is our most popular webinar and is key to understanding your child's emotional well-being and the resulting behaviours from that. So moving on, who am I? As I said, I'm Nikki Green. I have been supporting children and young people with their emotional well-being for scarily over 2 decades now. In that time, as well as supporting those young people directly and still doing so to this day, I do also train parents, carers, and education professionals, or in fact social workers, foster carers, etc. And that is under the banner of the Contented Child. So if you're looking for more content, then do find us on Facebook, where we post lots of hopefully useful articles and resources for you. So this is absolutely the topic that I am most passionate about. So I've been asked to record 20 minutes for you, so it's much more likely to go on for longer than that. So if we start out, this is a quote that I heard many years ago, well, 20, and it really stuck with me, and it underlines how important it is that we educate children around emotional regulation. So, emotional literacy is actually a better predictor of lifelong achievement than is conventional IQ. A person's IQ predicts only a small part of lifelong success, ranging from 4 to 20%. Emotional intelligence, on the other hand, predicts about 80, so you could say 80 to 96% of a person's success in life. And that quote is from Jean Gross. So absolutely, and we see it time and time again with young people, if we can educate them around emotional regulation, then in turn their learning comes on. So we really shouldn't underestimate the value of children being educated around this topic. So what is emotional intelligence? So what components make up an emotionally intelligent child or adult indeed? So there's going to be that self-awareness. So the awareness, and as adults watching this, you will have developed an awareness for yourself of those things that you find tricky, those aspects of your character, for instance, as well. But then the ability to regulate those emotions yourself. And you need empathy, so that ability to put yourself in somebody else's shoes. So for instance, a lot of the time when we're brainstorming situations, we maybe put ourselves in someone else's shoes to think about how we might react to it. If you have those, you will naturally be a more motivated person. And what you see with young people who are struggling with their emotional regulation is indeed that motivation goes. And also making up that emotionally intelligent person is those social skills, and having that ability to communicate with others around you. Something that, for instance, if you've got a child with autism or some other diagnosis, they may need some extra help in that area to develop those skills. So what is emotional literacy? We've heard those terms a lot. You know, some of you may hear that your young people are doing emotional literacy in school. So a child or young person who is emotionally literate is aware of and can usually explain the feelings that they're experiencing. So if you look at, for instance, at our toddlers who, when things go wrong, they very much have a meltdown, often quite loudly, and they're probably unable to tell you what's gone wrong, how they're feeling, and what caused that. so yes, can usually understand what caused that feeling and indeed be able to communicate that, and knows the best way to behave to deal with those feelings. So this is where behaviour really comes into it. So often when you're seeing behaviours, that's very much linked into the child's response to what is going on around them. And pulling in that empathy can take other people's feelings into account in any situation. And so, for instance, often when you reflect with a child after something has happened, if they may not be able to see it from the other point of view, and that's often something we need to work on with young people. So what is emotional regulation? So emotional regulation is a child or young person's ability to regulate or to manage his or her emotions. And absolutely, sometimes as adults, we get this wrong as well. To express his or her feelings in constructive rather than impulsive or hurtful ways. So we learn to self-regulate our nervous system, and our emotions, by consistent experiences with another calm, regulated nervous system. So a trusted adult. So self-regulation begins with co-regulation. So as such, you are a role model for your child. And indeed, often when I work with children who are either anxious or maybe those children who resort to anger, it's often the fact that they'll share with me that they've also got a parent who is anxious or a parent who has a bit of a short fuse. So just bearing in mind that you are your child's role model in that respect. So we want to role model to them when we're dealing with tricky situations. In particular, we want to model the response that we would hope that they would also have. And you know, that's not always easy, particularly if our stress bucket, our own personal stress bucket, is overwhelmed, is overflowing. So, excuse me there, we skipped over one. So emotional dysregulation. So if a child is emotionally dysregulated often, then what you can find is there is problems in their relationships, particularly those children who do their emotional regulation becomes anger, and there may be that child who hits out, who is very physical. That can often create problems in relationships. So for instance, a child who does hit out, other children are going to become a little bit wary around them. For that child that is anxious, for instance, those mornings when you're trying to get them out the door and to school and they're struggling, you know, you're trying to get out the door on time in the morning, that can really cause some frustration within the family unit. So anxiety about the emotion or the dysregulation. So, for instance, children going into a situation that they know is going to be difficult for them to manage will automatically become more anxious about that. And that means they're more likely to become dysregulated. And we'll talk about that when we talk about the brain. So fears of abandonment typically comes in with that self-judgment. So we're seeing a lot of young people saying things like, you don't love me, I may as well be dead, etc. It's all wrapped up in that self-esteem and that anxiety around their emotions. And what I have to say there is, if you have got a young person, certainly in those teenagers who is expressing an intent to self-harm, then please do go and see your GP. For a younger child, it comes from that being overwhelmed, and may not necessarily mean that there is a real intention, but you should always be passing that on to medical professionals. So problem thinking and problem solving. So, and when we talk about the brain, once again, you'll hear how that problem-solving part of the brain shuts down when we become dysregulated, and all rational thought tends to go out the window. So we've already just covered that self-judgments with comments like saying, I'm rubbish, I can't do this, etc. You might see attempts to avoid or numb, and that comes from the anxiety, the fear. So children may appear to be quite defiant, but in actual fact, that is a protective instinct. When they become dysregulated, they're more likely to show those impulsive behaviours. And in fact, you know, in the home environment, you may have one of your children maybe lashes out at the other. And when you say to them, why did they do it? They may well respond with, I don't know why. So for adults, for you, that can be very frustrating, and it may be, well, how can you not know why? Actually, once a child becomes dysregulated, those behaviours are driven by the subconscious as a form of protection. So they may not know why they have done it. And repeated emotional dysregulation leads into low self-esteem. In fact, it's thought that young people with ADHD by the age of 12 will have received 20,000 more negative interactions than their peers. Okay, mostly in the school environment. So you can understand how that chips away at a child's self-esteem, and which is why it's so important that we do manage behaviour positively rather than heaping up on those negatives on a child whose self-esteem is already impacted. So emotional regulation means being able to think constructively about how to cope with your feelings. Now, the important thing is we want children to have those feelings, those uncomfortable ones, but not to become overwhelmed by them. So we want them to feel discouraged, but not to give up. And I'm sure you'll be hearing about growth mindset if you haven't already. So lots of schools are now putting growth mindset into their curriculum. And that's about that keep persisting, to feel anxious but not to stay home. So for instance, sometimes as adults, particularly with anxious children who bring out all our nurturing instincts, we want to protect them. But sometimes in protecting them, we are actually enabling that anxiety. And to be excited, but not to get so carried away in their enthusiasm that they use poor judgment in making decisions. So as a parent, it's important to take note that it is as difficult to manage anger and frustration as excitement. And it's often when your child gets too excited that emotional regulation becomes difficult, and you may see things go wrong. So benefits of improved emotional literacy and regulation. And indeed, I do see this. I'm fortunate enough that I work in a school and have for some while, 2 days a week, where I deliver emotional regulation one-to-one to children and then see them move up through the school. So I absolutely have seen these benefits with young people, as well as hearing from parents whose children I've supported outside school. I get lovely regular updates about how those children are doing now. So once we have worked on their ability to regulate their emotions, what we notice is children can pay more attention. You'll understand that more when we talk about the brain. They can work harder because they're more motivated. If they're working harder, then they will achieve more. And that in turn builds that self-esteem. So they're more likely to be able to take on challenges. So hopefully we've worked on that impulse control so they're more able to problem solve and maybe to resolve conflicts with their peers or with siblings. They'll show lower levels of stress and anxiety, be more caring towards others because hopefully we've worked on that empathy. And most importantly, they are happier children. And now with mental health being so high on the agenda, we actually want to create a child who is able to look after their own well-being. So, but if children cannot process their feelings successfully, those feelings can be stuck. And every time they're in a similar situation, they'll respond by experiencing the same emotion that will be subconscious. So, for instance, an example here, if a child feels shame when they're asked to read, and so particularly think here about your young people maybe with dyslexia, for whom reading is that much trickier. So if they struggle with reading, then and that emotion around that, or indeed the reading itself, is not helpfully scaffolded, the emotions aren't processed helpfully, then they'll always connect reading with a negative emotion. So for instance, that child will automatically go into meltdown as soon as they're put in the situation to read. And in fact, I had a similar situation with a young lady once who got locked in the toilets, and that became a phobia of going into a toilet and locking the door. So we have to, if that has happened, we have to work to undo that stored emotion against that experience. So signs of poor emotional literacy or regulation is children who cannot describe how they're feeling, that they rarely talk about their emotions. So researchers recently found that boys tend to stop talking about emotions at the age of 15. So it's really important that we keep our teenagers, particularly the boys. We know that girls naturally do it within their friendship groups, but particularly we need to be looking at those boys to keep them talking and sharing their emotions, that they don't ask for or expect help. And even if you think that your young person does know that they can ask for and expect help, check, because they may not like to. That they express their emotions in unhelpful ways. That might be hitting, being very physical, it may be shouting, or on the other side of the coin, it might be sulking. But also afterwards, don't recognize that their emotions got the better of them. And a good way to be able to identify that is children who refuse to reflect. So once the situation has ended, that they refuse to talk about it. They almost want to box it up and put it away. Whereas actually, if you allow them to do that, then you are losing the opportunity for a learning experience. Absolutely, it is a learning experience that if we talk through, we can work on healthier alternatives with them. So we're now going to have a little bit of brain theory, only as much, it can seem quite a lot, but only as much as is necessary for you to understand what I then want to talk to you about. So I've missed out the headline, the most important part. Emotional regulation is not fully developed until the age of 25. And in fact, some research goes as far as to suggest maybe even 30. So I'm sure there will be some people here who may be thinking of someone over 30 who they consider still isn't emotionally mature. Recent research has found that adults and children's brains work differently. Adults think with the prefrontal cortex. This is the brain's rational part, so it's the conscious part. It's the part of the brain that responds to situations with good judgment, that self-awareness, that empathy, remember the ability to look at it from other viewpoints, and an awareness of consequences, i.e. thinking, if I do this, then this would be the consequence. And often that is what stops us from going down a certain route of actions. And your impulse control, importantly, is in that area also. Whereas children process information with the amygdala, which is in the limbic system, it's the emotional brain. So in children's brains, also, the connections between that emotional, the amygdala part of the brain, and the decision-making center, so that rational brain that we as adults have, are still developing. So that's why when children get overwhelming emotional input, they can't explain later what they were thinking. So whereas we would shuffle it up to that rational brain and work it through, children can't do that if the information received is overwhelming. So they're not thinking about the situation so much as they're feeling the situation. And say for a toddler, that can be as simple as you've given them a red cup instead of their favorite blue cup. So if we look at the brain, so first of all, we've got the primitive brain there in the red. That controls our basic functions like our heart rate, our breathing, digestion, and sleeping. And that part of the brain is developing from conception up to 6 months. We then, in the green there, look at the limbic system. So that's responsible for emotions. That's where our survival instinct is and our memory. So that is when something first happens. That is the first area in our brain that receives that information into that emotional brain. And our brains are predisposed to defer to the negative. This part of the brain is about keeping us safe from harm. Now, the amygdala can be hypo, so underreactive, or it can be hyperreactive to input. So for instance, you may have a child who seems to react very quickly. That may be a child whose emotional brain is hyperreactive. Now that part of the brain is developing from 2 to 7 years. Now that prefrontal cortex, that part of the brain that for those of us over 25, over 30, is fully developed. It's housing our working memory, our ability to regulate emotions and our subsequent responses, our self-awareness, to control our social behaviour, and where it houses our good judgment and healthy choices, awareness of consequences and empathy. And that is developing from 7 years to adult. So that gives you some idea why emotional regulation is so difficult for some of our little ones. Now, what happens in terms of, so I write interventions to work with young people to teach them how to regulate their emotions. And the resource on your left there is one from that intervention with young people to explain to them how their brain works. Now, if we're calm and we're relaxed, then children may be able to access that higher cortex, that rational brain. However, if our limbic system, and we use a hand model to explain this to children, with the brain stem being here at the wrist, the amygdala, that emotional brain coming across in the middle here, with that rational brain coming over the top. Now, if you're calm and relaxed, this works for adults as well as for children, then you can access that rational brain. However, if the emotion that's coming into the amygdala is high loaded emotion, such as frustration, anger, excitement, then that can set in motion the survival instinct. When that happens, the prefrontal cortex disconnects. The body will be flooded with cortisol and adrenaline, and that becomes the point at which your young person is only reacting from the subconscious. And indeed, it's really important to know actually that if that is triggered within your child, then the changes that happen within the body can take 20 to 60 minutes to dissipate if the trigger is removed. Now, if your child is calm, your child or young person is calm, then that means that upstairs brain, often called by people, that prefrontal cortex, is engaged. They will be able to think before they act because they've got that impulse control. They will be in control of their body and reactions. They can focus to learn and concentrate. They may have that empathy, so can see it from the other point of view, that they can think before they speak, and that they feel like they can get their work done and take on challenges. However, if that prefrontal cortex is disconnected, then your young person will act before they think. For instance, lash out at a sibling. They're not in control of their body and reactions because the brain has put them into survival mode. And so particularly if someone gets in their way, then they may push them out of their way. They will see it as a threat. They're too stressed to focus. In fact, they'll struggle to communicate or to understand communication towards them. You might see yelling, arguing, or running away. They may only see the problem from their point of view. And in fact, when a child is dysregulated, there is no point in trying to reflect with them because they won't be able to see that other point of view. And that they feel like they cannot get anything done. They won't be motivated. So when we see when the survival instinct is triggered, and remember, this is the point at which your child or young person is feeling fearful. They feel at their most vulnerable, even if they don't look like they are. So fight, flight, freeze, or more recently talked about is fawn. So fight, much more obvious to spot. So physically or verbally lashing out. In fact, you may even see self-harm at this time. Arguing, defiant behaviour, standing their ground, getting ready to fight. It might be clenching fists, might be grinding their teeth or tensing their jaw. Meltdowns, may become overly emotional, might be kicking, stomping, or smashing. That's how fight will look. And it is important to remember that anger is a secondary emotion. Anger is always going to be underpinned by a primary emotion, often that being anxiety. And I work with young people to teach them to be able to communicate that primary emotion before it becomes anger, because obviously anger causes a lot more issues than if they can ask for help prior to that. Flight looks like running away, maybe hiding, going under tables, or maybe those children who are very restless, you know, added in with the adrenaline that's going to be flooding their body. You might see shallow breathing. You might see that tenseness of lifting the shoulders, or that wide-eyed look of feeling trapped. Freeze. Now that looks more like you're shutting down, becoming non-responsive, which can look like defiance. Non-verbal, and so selective mutism, those children who don't talk in certain situations. That is not a conscious choice to not talk. It is the anxiety which is driving that, and they physically cannot talk. So that demand avoidance, the saying no, holding breath, maybe heart pounding, or maybe even a decreased heart rate. Now, fawn, another word for fawn is also appease. I can absolutely say we see these children in school where they contain it in school. They may come home and then melt down at home, show a totally different response, like for instance, fight. But because they want to follow the rules, etc., in school, they may hold it in. And that's often those anxious children. So what we might see in school is that child who's a people pleaser, who may get that label of attention seeking because they're always looking for adult attention. They're too scared to say what they think, and actually often they might be that child who says yes to situations that absolutely they don't want to get involved with. They might flatter others. So in school we get those children who'll flatter you on your new haircut, what you're wearing, etc. And also those children who over apologize, so might say sorry, 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 as soon as they perceive a negative, and often apologize in situations where they absolutely do not need to. So how can we help these young people? So, as I said earlier, self-regulation begins to develop by accessing co-regulation with a safe, trusted adult. And so bearing in mind that is you, you might want to start thinking about your responses when your child is around. Now, we need to provide a warm, responsive relationship, structure the environment around the young person, and then we want to teach, coach those self-regulation skills. As much as you might sit and do homework with your young people, we also need to be working on those emotion skills as well, and it will in turn benefit their education. So within providing that warm, responsive relationship, take an interest in your child. Take an interest in their activities, their likes and dislikes, you know, whilst, so currently I'm in a tier 4 situation, you know, activities are rather curtailed, activities outside the home at the moment, but we can be encouraging the activities they can still do, encouraging that connection with their peers, for instance. Encourage them to express their feelings. So talk to them about how they're feeling, and there is some script coming up. But also respect their feelings. So for instance, typically with anxiety, parents might say to a child, you don't need to worry about that. Actually, the message our young people will take from that is that you're not interested in their worry. So remembering that if a situation's happening for them, it's coming from their perspective, okay, from their perception. So they haven't had the years of experience that we've had. Some things to them, particularly the first time of doing it, might seem scary. And when you think about the environment we're in currently, with the pandemic, you know, a lot of things have changed for our young people. And so their anxiety could be riding high. So you may have seen some regression in their behaviour, but you also might see anxiety raising its head more often. And certainly we know connection is important for well-being. So make sure you're developing those relationships with peers. So structure the environment, and a note here is certainly if you have a young person with a diagnosis, for instance, sensory processing issues, autism, ADHD, structure the environment around that child. Give on and allow the child to make their choices, create that independence. So often we do things for our children that in actual fact they can do for themselves. And all we are teaching them is that they need us. So we need to encourage that independence. And sometimes that means letting them make choices that we know will go wrong. So as long as we have that structure around them to support them with that absolutely is something we need to be doing. Establish routines and stick with them. And those routines are important, particularly in those times where anxiety is high. Be consistent and predictable. So for instance, if there's two adults within the home setting, make sure that you're on the same page so that you are consistent. And indeed, in times of high anxiety, what we need to do is tighten boundaries and be even more consistent for our young people, because that makes them feel safer. So establish those rules and resulting consequences. And absolutely go away from this and ask your children, what are the rules at home? And you'd be surprised how many children can quote you the school rules, but then aren't aware of rules at home. So make sure that children are aware what we are looking for from them. And keeping things positive. So we do actually have a webinar, which is positive approaches towards behaviour at home. So if you're feeling you're stuck in that negative situation at home where you're just taking away things as a consequence all the time, then do maybe have a look at that on our website. So teaching and coaching those self-regulation skills. So now emotional regulation is very personalized. And so when I work with young people, on the whole, I work with them one-to-one, because everyone is individual. If you just think about the survival responses, some children will show very different survival responses and in different situations. As I said earlier, they may be a child who freezes or who fawns at school, but is more likely to fight at home. We need to identify triggers relating to the individual child. And this is where reflection upon situations comes in really useful, because if we reflect, then we can find out what that trigger was and educate the child around what their own triggers are. If there is any form of diagnosis, then educate and empower around diagnosis. So I also deliver content to young people when they have just received a diagnosis, very much on the basis of empowering them. And so, for instance, you may have autism, but we can teach you strategies to manage that. And that's really empowering for a child. Ensuring all adults around the child are aware of that child's presentation, so anyone within the home, but also making sure your child's school is aware of any triggers they may have. We have documents in school called pen profiles that we make for each child, so that if any adult comes into contact with that child, they're able to have a look at that pen profile and to know the triggers, the likely behaviours, but also how best to manage that child. And so those personalised calming strategies, because we all have different ways of calming and relaxing. So just bearing in mind, autism, ADHD, for those young people, they are more likely to be more hyper towards emotional stimulation. But also checking their understanding of emotions. So for instance, our little ones are going to have a much smaller pool of emotions that they can recognize. And so it's very much about us educating them around them, linked to events. So for instance, I would say to a child, I can see you're looking angry because, and link it to the event that in your perception has made them angry. So also educate them around the anger cycle and the physical indicators of rising emotions, which we're going to have a look at in a moment. So the 5 steps to teaching emotions is give them the name for what they are feeling. So for instance, I can see you're feeling anxious. And research has shown if we name the feeling, then that amygdala, which is pre-programmed to defer to the negative, if we give that amygdala a name for the emotion, then it is possible that will calm down the response. So as I said earlier, link the emotions to the cause for them and for other people. So for instance, you might say to them, I'm feeling sad that you hurt your brother. Encourage them to look at faces to see emotions. Now, obviously, this is appropriate for younger children. So I might say to a younger child, look at my face. How do you think I'm feeling? So using a feelings chart so that everyone can show how they're feeling. So for instance, young people I work with have a laminated emotions chart, which goes on the fridge at home, and everyone shows where they are emotionally. Obviously, that's more appropriate for that primary age range. So if you feel that your child struggles to express their emotions to you, then that's a great resource. And if you're looking at littlies, then starting one emotion at a time. Typically, you'd start with your happy, sad, angry emotions. So emotion coaching phrases, of which I've given you a couple of examples. So it is okay to be upset, and it's really important that we get across it's okay to be angry as well. All emotions are healthy. It's what we do with those emotions that sometimes isn't. So it's good to let it out. It is not okay to say hurtful things or hurt others. Some children, particularly those ones who go into the flight mode, may need to just be left alone in their own space, but will need that reassurance that I'm here when you need me. And I also find another really good one for diffusing meltdowns is to say to a child, it must be really scary to feel out of control. And indeed, you'll know yourself if you get angry, when you lose that ability to think straight, when you're driven by your emotions, it is a scary feeling. So imagine experiencing that as a child. So how can we involve children in developing their emotional literacy? So acknowledging those emotions and actually often sharing your experiences as a child. So for instance, I know you're anxious about that, and I used to worry about that when I was a child as well. That's very empowering for children. But ask them what happened to cause that feeling. How does that feeling feel in your body? If we're looking at empathy, so for instance, if they've hurt a sibling and the sibling is crying, for instance, then say to them, you've hurt them. How do you think they're feeling? They're feeling sad. Well, how would you have felt if they'd have hit you? And get them to identify that. Talking through with them what situations make you feel happy, sad, excited, and indeed that's a good starting point for checking if your child has an understanding of emotions. Helping them to develop empathy, so we know that they're more likely to respond helpfully to uncomfortable situations, be better at making and maintaining friendships, and to be happy. So we can develop empathy by using stories and pictures. So for instance, when a child brings home their reading book, if you're reading it with them, ask them how they think the character feels and why they feel that way. And you can also use that when you're watching movies or TV programs. Use those real situations, so that reflection. So if something has happened, once afterwards the child is fully calmed down, back to calm in a very non-judgmental way, talk about the situation and about how they felt. And do lots of that, as I mentioned earlier, looking at faces and talking about what emotions are they showing. So every child, as indeed every adult, will be different when they're rising up that anger anxiety scale. So because of that adrenaline flooding the body, you may see they can't keep still, they may get very fidgety, because the prefrontal cortex disconnecting, they may become non-verbal. You might see that clenching fists or frowning. Their temperature may rise, so you might see very flushed face, you might see stamping feet or deep breathing, often not deep breathing correctly to get that oxygen back to the brain to calm down. So really have a think, have a look at your child when they're becoming dysregulated and see what signs you can see that they are escalating. And indeed, it's those, if a child is working with me, I'm looking to identify what I call the amber area. When a child is escalating, I want to know what behaviours I'll see in that area rather than the full-on meltdown, which by then the changes have happened in the body and it's often too late to get a child back to calm. However, if we can identify when they're first starting to escalate and we can put in appropriate strategies at that point, we can often bring them back to the green zone, the calm zone, without them going to meltdown. So as I said, that's very individual for each child. And you will want to create a calming plan. So work out what you're going to do when things go wrong. So it may be that your child has a den, somewhere they can go to be on their own, that they maybe have a calming box to use with different resources in, that they may be within that area have some prompts. So for instance, some deep breathing prompts, some emotional prompts, but also some distraction tools, for instance, music or colouring. And for some people, it might be that they go on to a tablet, although I wouldn't recommend too much of that because that tends to be a distraction from actually learning to manage their behaviour. So I've got some ideas there for some calming strategies. We always want to have deep breathing in there. We want to get oxygen back to that rational brain so it can think about those good choices. We want children to remove themselves from situations that are tricky. So from triggers, if they can remove themselves from a trigger, they're going to be able to calm down quicker. And this is particularly true and important for those children who have issues within the playground when the adult support isn't at such a high level. Now, favourite strategy for lots of children that I support, obviously at the moment you could only do this in your family bubbles, but the importance of a hug. A 20-second hug for girls, 60 seconds for boys, and that's down to the male hormones, releases the hormone oxytocin. So oxytocin is that hormone that makes us feel safe, makes us feel loved. So a firm hug will send that oxytocin burst to the brain, which overrides those fears and anxiety and gets across the message that you're safe. However, I wouldn't put in this strategy. You certainly shouldn't force it. You should ask a child, do you need a hug? And it's thought that we need 8 hugs a day for maintenance, okay, for our well-being. You do feel a tension ebbing out of a child's body when you are doing this, but as I say, it must be during that escalation phase before it goes too far. Otherwise, you might find yourself in a physical situation. So building coping skills, coach the child to be able to reflect upon crisis situations. So as I said earlier, if your young person finds it hard to reflect, keep working on it. Make sure it's non-judgmental. Talk about we're reflecting, we're talking about something that has happened so we can help you, so that we can work out how you could have managed it differently in future. So work through those solutions with the child. And indeed, if I work with young people on coping and calming strategies for those younger children, I'll often put those solutions on a key ring so that at the point that that young child is struggling, if they've lost that ability to think rationally, they have got a visual reminder on them to remind them of their healthy coping strategies. But also consider mindfulness, yoga. We know for a fact that mindfulness and yoga, putting yourself in the moment, strengthens the connections between that limbic system and the rational brain. So those children will find it easier to access that rational brain. And I've recently been part of a project on this in primary school, and we have noticed the impact on our young people. So not forgetting that ability to reflect. So it's about using it as an education tool, and there is a prompt on the screen there. If anybody does want any of the resources they've seen in this presentation today, then you're welcome to message me through the Contented Child Facebook page. And I'm happy to share resources with you. You're only seeing a fraction of some of them that we do have. So making sure you use those opportunities to educate your young person about healthy choices. And not forgetting the positivity. I'm sure you've heard lots about this already, but we do know that those brains which defer to the negative, often, particularly those brains which are hyperreactive, can be stuck in a negative bias. And so that each time a slightest negative comes in, we see a very exaggerated response. Now, we know through research that we can retrain the brain to look to the positive by finding 3 positives a day. And within 21 days, you should start to see some impact on this. So there's another one of my prompts on the screen here, the I Can Journal, which you're welcome to contact me for. Absolutely, this is so well worthwhile doing with your young people. It also makes a lovely activity excuse me, to sit and do over the dinner table, for instance, with your young people. If you have older children or those with tablets, there's a fantastic app called One of Many, but the one I like to use is 3 Good Things. You can set an alarm on it so it goes off at a certain time in the evening, and it prompts you to put in your 3 good things for the day. And please don't underestimate the value of doing this in terms of your young people's self-esteem. So that's bringing us to the end of what has been a really whirlwind tour of emotional regulation. So usually this would be a 2-hour presentation. So the summary of strategies that I have gone through today is develop an understanding of emotions in your young people, and indeed model those yourself. Build not only yours, but also their awareness of their triggers so that you can structure that environment. You can prep them for situations that may be tricky for them. And you know, I'm doing this now just on top of Christmas, and absolutely Christmas Day, when that excitement's high, is absolutely a classic time for things to go wrong. Encourage them to talk about their emotions, to reflect and develop their problem-solving skills. Educate them as to how this feels in their bodies. So that trigger, so when I see you start to frown, I know things are starting to go wrong. And this is when you can walk away, go and play with your Lego, or use your deep breathing app, for instance. And support them to continue to develop healthy habits and coping strategies. We need them to have those healthy habits for their emotional well-being, and that emotional well-being starts with emotional regulation. So thank you very much for joining me for this session. I hope it's been useful for you. Please do feedback to Jack or Rob, and hopefully we can do some more content for you in the future on different topics.